New opinion polls show British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Conservative Party has maintained its lead over the opposition Labour ahead of the December 12th general elections. Survey by Opinion Polls Centre indicates UK Conservatives' lead has widened down to 15 points, while Delta Poll says Johnson's party is ahead with a 10 percentage point difference. A December vote is Johnson's attempt to push his Brexit deal with the European Union. Johnson has also ruled out another referendum, but says he'll agree to a vote next year if the Scottish National Party helps him secure a parliamentary majority. However, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn says he will not allow such a referendum for at least 2 years, and his party is determined to win this parliamentary vote. And now joining us for this news review is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol, and James Tweedy, journalist and commentator, joining us from Plymouth. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. I guess, Tony, we'll start with you. Where do we stand today?
Well, I think we're finding out that the media is always, particularly the mass media, is always playing an important role when it comes to general elections these days. Back in the old days, the candidates used to stand out in the city square, in the street, and crowds of people would gather around them where they would put forward their case, vote for me. Nowadays, this all happens in nice air-conditioned offices and studios, and of course the access to those studios, the questions asked, and all those kind of considerations are much more controlled than they were in the old days. So there is an opportunity for the mass media to make a big difference in spinning stories, candidates, one way or another. And we've seen this with this general election very much. Boris Johnson, although he started off the election campaign very much ahead in the polls, he's still ahead, but he has a major problem in that he has not been actually turning up to some of the debates. He doesn't want to face his main opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party, head on in a live TV debate. He's also refused to stand questioning by Andrew Neil on the Daily Politics programme. He's the BBC's #1 political interviewer. Boris Johnson has so far refused to do an interview with him. He may do at some point, but it does look as if Boris is running scared. This is definitely not going to play well amongst the public. If they think that he's simply not prepared to face difficult questions on television, Boris may well lose some of his lead that he's currently got.
And James, your initial thoughts on this?
Well, it's interesting what Tony says about the old style campaigning of going out and speaking on the hustings and at rallies, because in the last election, Jeremy Corbyn did very well because by going around the country and speaking at rallies, and we haven't seen so much of that from him in this election. He's doing a lot of press conferences down in London, and Labour's campaign is very negative so far. It's scaremongering about Brexit, which is really going to be fatal, I think. Slinging insults at Boris Johnson, digging up things that he said 25 years ago or wrote 25 years ago, and so forth. And, you know, it's not strictly true that Johnson is avoiding the press because he's speaking up and down the country too, and he's going on the telly and the radio quite often. Labour's made things very difficult for itself in this election. I think Labour has thrown it. Labour has lost the fight, and largely it's because they couldn't really avoid this election being about Brexit, and Labour's Brexit policy is a real mess. And now you see that Labour is going on the defensive. It's stopped trying to win seats from the Conservative Party, and it's going back to defending the seats that it already holds, because the Conservative Party is threatening to actually take a lot of those away from Labour and win quite a big majority.
And it's funny because it seems Jeremy Corbyn is kind of playing the fence with respect to Brexit to try to get voters on board. Tony, do you think Labour's out of the race? Why or why not?
Well, it's not totally out of the race because they have a very strong social justice platform they're on. The only trouble is this election is not really about social justice. It's about Brexit. Most of the country understand that Parliament was deadlocked because there were too many members of Parliament who were stopping Brexit actually happening, even though they'd committed to it. So this is the elephant in the room is Brexit, and the Labour Party don't seem to have really got their heads around this. The other problem for Labour is that something like 13 or 14 of their main target seats up in the north of England are pro-Brexit seats, and yet they're standing on a kind of mealy-mouthed half Brexit, which really means that they prefer Remain. And so, though it's quite feasible that Labour might lose those target seats that they've got, those marginal seats up in the north of England. So, you know, Boris, though, the biggest irony about this election, I must say, and I don't see any of the commentators on the UK television saying this, is that actually Boris, he is a neoliberal. He's part of the international elite, ergo, he's pro-Brussels, really. He's in with the international bankers, the big multinational corporations. He's not particularly patriotic, although he says he is. He goes along with these international policies. So you would have thought he would be a Remainer. Jeremy Corbyn, however, has spent his whole life campaigning against Brussels, so you would think he should be in the Leave camp. But actually what we've got is we've got them both in the opposite camps to what most of their track record as individuals says they should be, which I think shows just how hypocritical the party political system is here, that we get people presented to vote for who are actually on the opposite side of the Brexit debate to what they say they are.
That's great food for thought there. It's a good point. Now, James, we know that Donald Trump is going to show up for a NATO summit Tuesday. Meanwhile, I mean, all along he showed quite a bit of support for Boris Johnson. We haven't seen Boris very vocal, reciprocating that support as of late. Why?
I think it's kind of in response to some of Labour's attacks, their claims, which have mostly largely been debunked, that the Conservative Party is planning to open up the NHS, the National Health Service, to privatisation from the USA. I think there's, you know, the Labour's got a strong attack line there, a fairly strong attack line there, and Johnson is keeping his distance there. So that's, you know, that's wise. I think Johnson, his best bet is to be as uncontroversial as possible and keep talking about Brexit, which he always does. Every question he's asked comes back to Brexit. Labour, well, let me see. Moving on, yes, I think what's very interesting about this is that, you know, touching on something Tony said there, is that if Boris Johnson wins, if the Conservatives win this election, they, you know, they will leave the EU in some form. Britain will leave the EU in some form that would actually allow Labour's manifesto, the best part of Labour's manifesto, to be implemented. Because if Labour wins, whether we have this customs union, you know, leave it, Brexit in name only, or we stay in the EU, the Labour Party can't really implement some of the best parts, because we're talking about bringing the rail operators' franchises back into public ownership, renationalising the Royal Mail, renationalising the water boards, the water companies, and this thing about the NHS, trying to prevent privatisation in the NHS, because under EU rules, all services, all public services, including healthcare services, have to be what they call contestable, which means that they have to be put out, the contracts have to be put out to public tender. They have private companies have to be able to bid for them in a process which is supposedly fair, and so of course they, you know, this has been going on in Britain for 20 odd years now.
Well, look, if I can just come in, this is one of the main problems for Corbyn. Is much of his programme of nationalisation would fall foul of the state aid rules, which would be ruled over by the European Court of Justice, which he and his party stay in. So it's almost as if he's campaigning for something, but actually, if we do stay in the EU, he won't be able to have it, and he's campaigning to stay in. So there's an enormous hypocrisy, actually, at the heart of what Labour is doing, and it's not surprising, because they got bounced into this election. They didn't want to have it, and it was the Scottish nationalists with the Tories that forced this general election onto Labour. That's the last thing they wanted.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the other point here is that Jeremy Corbyn isn't really running the party anymore. You see people who, you know, who are dead set against him really politically, like Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, so who's really the Remain secretary, and others, they can say what they want.
Blairites, aren't they?
Say what they want.
This is the ghost of Tony Blair.
Exactly, all the Blairites. They're running the party. They've been able to. There's been a quiet civil war in the Labour Party, and they've driven out anyone who shares the same politics as Jeremy Corbyn, most notably Chris Williamson, the MP for Derby North, and they've pushed all those guys out, and they run around and they do exactly what they want. Jeremy Corbyn says he's neutral on. He's going to be neutral on Brexit if he forms a government. A couple of days later, John McDonnell, who's supposed to be his closest ally, is saying, yes, but all our MPs will be free to vote to campaign for however they want, which means they're going to campaign for Remain. Everyone knows that because they've all signed pledges saying that they're going to do it. So, who are you voting for here? You're going to elect a Labour government thinking you're going to get Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister, and maybe you're not. You're not going to elect a Labour government.
Time is almost getting the better of us. We have less than 40 seconds left. Tony, your final thoughts.
Okay, well, the Middle East is a big player in this general election. We've seen an enormous campaign this week by the chief rabbi in the UK, Ephraim Mervis, to smear Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite. The mass media makes these big decisions. They have not reported at all that Rabbi Meir Weinberger from the United European Jews is an Orthodox organisation. Tens of thousands of Jews part of that, not reported at all. So the media have effectively enabled Mervis to smear Corbyn as an anti-Semite without putting the other side at all. Now that is not journalism, that's just propaganda and smear, and that's what we've seen all over the British London media this week.
Always a pleasure to have you both on. Thank you both dearly. Tony Gosling out of Bristol and James Tweedy joining us there from Plymouth. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.